Well, thank you. I'm very excited about having you here. We had a call yesterday about the panel, and at some point, those two guys, they couldn't stop talking. So I had to say, oh, sorry, I'm running out of time, because they had so many interesting things to say. So as Mike said, my alma mater, we're going to talk about data when it comes to the refugee crisis in particular. And of course, just to frame the topic a bit, I think most of you would say that if there is too much tech and too much data when it comes to this issue, it can lead to some sort of surveillance state, so not something that we want. And if there's too little tech, maybe it's less efficient for those, the displaced and the refugees and the migrants who are looking for a better life. So we're going to cover a broad set of topics. Maybe we can start with the identity of the refugees, ID documents. When you're leaving your country, and it's been the case in Syria, in Myanmar, and you're leaving everything behind, and you come to a new country, you don't have anything with you. How does it work? How do you think somebody can integrate in a new society with no ID document and no proof of who they are?
And I think that's one of the big challenges that many refugees face, of course, because they leave behind the main legal markers of their identity. And that's where data and the way in which the data is held can obviously help to allow them to reconstruct that identity in a host country. We heard in the last session about self-sovereign identity and ways in which you can use blockchain maybe to implement that and have a immutable kind of identity that allows you to move around freely without losing that identity because you've crossed borders. So that's obviously a very useful and important area of innovation. One of the challenges, though, of course, is that the host country sort of becomes much more in control in reconstruct. Without those kind of technologies, the host country has much more power in reconstructing your identity because they're essentially, the ones who are assigning you a, particular marker. You're a refugee, or you live in a refugee camp, and that says a lot about, undermines the refugee's autonomy. And there's a large ethical and moral issue about who is allowed to construct your identity.
And so maybe there are some alternatives. Obviously, Estonia has been working a lot on e-citizenship, for instance. Fabrice, do you think it's the way forward to have some kind of digital form of identity?
I think having a universal identity is going to be a real huge challenge. And there are going to be some big side effects. So we have to think about the side effect before launching such a project. For example, I don't really see how we could decently have the equivalent of a KYC, a Know Your Customer, from a guy coming from Syria. Looks like it's impossible, and looks like fraud is going to be mainstream for such case. If we have fraud on such case, you will have people coming from other countries who are not supposed to have asylum in Europe, for example, let's say Algeria, and who will fraud the system. So the system will not be efficient at all. So it's a nice idea, putting our ID on the blockchain, but it can prove to be tricky, even for us, because we could face a world in our country, right here in France, in, who knows, 10 years, 20 years, where we might want to disappear and not being definitely linked to some ID. Because we could be facing some hostile government in the coming years. Not in the coming years, but at least in the coming decades. It could be there. So let's really think hard about the side effects of such an idea of having a universal identity that will never leave us.
And what do you propose? Do you think maybe it would be safer to have some kind of chip inserted into our arms, for instance, so that you could scan?
You mean RFID chip?
Yeah, for instance.
Oh yeah,
this is completely
terrific.
decentralized.
I remember in TechCrunch something like 5 years ago, even more. I think it was the Indonesian government or Thai government who were using RFID chips to identify people who were HIV positive in order to not let them enter some nightclubs. There are going to be some huge side effects if we start putting RFID chips into human beings. Let's stick with cats and dogs. when it comes to putting RFID chips. Really sounds dangerous for humans.
But let's say, because it's very provocative what you're saying, because if you arrive and you don't have any proof of your identity, it's very hard to find a job, to open a bank account, all these things. And you're saying it's actually a good thing that we can leave everything behind and disappear.
I'm
do you
saying
think,
that
do you
being
think governments
definitely stuck with your identity. Let's say we all have a chip, and I'm afraid this will come sooner or later. We all have a chip that enables any authority, or anybody for that matter, to check our identity. We will soon end up in a world where you would have devices all over us who would check who's here, when. We also already have such a device, it's our smartphone, but at least we can leave our smartphone at home and be only human beings without any tech and be kind of free to go anywhere we want, provided there is no facial ID around. But having our ID deeply in our own body has some very serious side effects. For us, for the migrant, for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, there's an obvious trade-off, right? So on the one hand, we should have a right to anonymity, and the sort of idea of right to be forgotten under the GDPR speaks to that, and many people have
it's
talked...
mostly about erasing search results, right?
Well, that was the case then it was decided in, but it's now much broader than that. It's the right to have data that's held on you, personal data, to be erased. And it speaks to this idea of that's inherent in privacy, that you should be able to manage your identity, not somebody else. So I agree that the idea that the blockchain will mean you can't maybe reinvent yourself, or there's a particular stereotype that follows you wherever you go, is unsatisfactory. But there's also sort of the opposite scenario, which is that many people who do leave one country and move to another are denied access to many services and basically the right to lead a kind of fulfilling life, a life of human flourishing, because they don't have that, because banks say you need proof of home address, or you need something very specific, which they just don't have. And the ability to use more sources of data, and also using technologies, applications like machine learning to process that data, can allow them, on the contrary, to actually create an identity that's useful to their life, not actually one that leads to their persecution.
Yeah, there are trade-offs in all the ways. Let me give you a personal and family souvenir about identity. During World War II, my grandfather was among the resistance in France, and his job among the resistance was to provide fake ID to Jewish kids in order for them to hide from the regime, the political regime in France. This would have been impossible with such technology, totally impossible. And as a reminder, there was a country next to France, Holland, Dutchland, where identity was sort of computerized. That was mechanography, that's the ancestor of computers. And in the 30s, in the early 20th century, they made a census of the whole population, and during the census, they were keeping track of what religion everybody practiced in the country, because they wanted to finance those religions in an equal way. 10 years later, when the Nazi regime invaded Dutchland, Holland, they took those files and made a quite simple, the equivalent at the time of a simple SQL query, and they got all the Jewish population. So once again, dealing with IT and identity, I'm pretty sure you agree with me on this one, we need to have an extensive conversation and lots of research before taking any kind of decision.
And Nikita, obviously you've been working on data sets and handling the sort of edge cases. Do you think we could find a balance, and maybe, for instance, in France, you can't have a database with people depending on the color of their skin. So we don't know how many black people there are in France, how many Asian people there are, and stuff like that. Do you think there should be some kind of restriction at the national level, European level, global level, so that maybe, yeah, we shouldn't put religion, for instance, in the ID documents?
Yeah, so well, just to say also that you gave a very important example. There's a modern day example in Myanmar with the Rohingya who face the same thing, where sort of going into Bangladesh, their identity is already constructed as Burmese refugees, and that already marks them out as a target of persecution. And in the scenario you describe, that possibility is taken away because they could reconstruct their identity by themselves, and no one would know that they are fleeing. And the main issue being that they're Muslim. So the point that you described, well, there is already a legal framework in place in Europe and in other countries. There are two things: there's data protection law and there's anti-discrimination laws. Now, the EU data protection framework, I can speak to that, and other countries are slowly adopting something of the same level. But that does say that, for example, it puts in place many restrictions on the processing of data that identifies a person's, race, or special, it's called sensitive data, race, political markers, religion, sex, so on, and the way in which you can sort of, address the processing of that kind of data is to use techniques like anonymization or pseudonymization, so that the data could still be useful. It still tells you information, but it doesn't reveal those very sensitive qualities that make people most vulnerable to, persecution.
Providing that your family name doesn't give any hints, which is often the case.
No, of course. So the standard, and I'm speaking again only to the GDPR, not to say that that's the only legal position, but the GDPR talks about anonymizing to the extent that you can't re-identify the individual.
I'm not. This is in the scientific field. There are lots of scientists who believe there's no possibility to anonymize anything, especially if you're facing a secret service who is trying to decipher what you're doing.
Yeah,
so that's a heavy topic of discussion within the scientific community. Can we anonymize data? It's not clear. As of today, it's not really clear if we are able, technically, to anonymize data.
So it's definitely, there's never any guarantee that you will not be able to re-identify. When you talk about apparatus of the state, certainly they have a much greater ability to re-identify by combining other information and re-identifying the person. But at weaker entities, I would say people with less sophisticated tools, maybe we're talking about, what I'm saying is that the possibility of re-identification is varied depending on who you're talking about, and it's possible that anonymization is still useful in certain circumstances, but against very, very powerful and data-rich actors, it may not be, as you say.
Yeah, and that's why data watchdogs are supposed to be here to check, for instance, in the UK with the NHS and the DeepMind deal, there were some issues because they were supposed to anonymize data sets, but you could actually cross-reference everything and find back if somebody has some medical condition based on this data set. And of course, the ICO, the British data watchdog, put a stop on all of this, but of course it was too late. Let's move on, and maybe it's a bit related, but let's talk about crossing borders. Because in many cases it's becoming harder and harder to cross borders. When you go to the US today, at the border they ask you, do you want to give us your Facebook profile and your Twitter profile so that we can check that you're a good citizen? For now, you have to opt in. It's not mandatory, but I don't know what's going to be in 10 years. And there's a new bridge that just opened as well between Hong Kong and mainland China, where they have cameras that can check if you're yawning while driving. They want to check your blood pressure and things like that. Do you think there's a danger in putting these huge barriers between countries right now?
I'm not sure. Is it a danger? Honestly, it's going on. We're today discovering a new world where walls are being built all over the place. So a border is just another wall. And obviously, we're going there. We're going into a world where there will be more and more wall, whether they are real wall or something a little more vicious that we're witnessing right now inside Europe, because there's not supposed to be any border within Europe, or new borders that will be reinvented. For example, the Saudis have built a huge border around their territory, which of course it's not a wall. It would be too much to build such a wall, but there are some means, technologically speaking, to build borders wherever you want today for quite a low price. So obviously we're facing the condition where tomorrow's world will be made of war, and if you want to travel the world tomorrow, one major problem will be crossing this wall. Even for us, French, going to the United States is, at least in terms of data, a threat. Nobody who realized what's going on in the United States would go with his personal laptop and his personal smartphone to cross the US border, because you're taking a risk. So basically, people like me who go to the United States quite often are doing exactly the same, are using the same tactics as if you're going to a weird dictatorship somewhere in the world. Do not use your personal smartphone, never take your personal laptop. Take a laptop that was designed to cross the border with nothing on it. And have alternative Facebook account in case you really have to give up your Facebook account, you give a fake one. It used to be something that we're told to cybersecurity members when they were going to weird countries. Today, you have to tell this to university professors who are going into the United States. And tomorrow, you'll probably have to say the same thing going to the UK, and most probably from UK to France. We have to learn what borders are becoming on a data point of view. And if you really dig into this topic, basically most of my data today are under the American legislation. So I'm already spread between different legislation when it comes to my personal data, and we all are.
Interesting. And when it comes to ethics, maybe, do you think these walls are designed for illegal migrants, for terrorists? Why are we building these kind of walls?
So just to clarify, you're sort of describing a data wall. Is that kind of?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm coming from London, and with Brexit less than 6 months away, I don't want to joke about walls too much. But yeah, I mean, I think that the main issue is that you're really going from a world in which you have hard sort of physical borders in a real world to one in which you have virtual borders, and these are more discrete, but then potentially, you know, they're invisible to the targets of them. So we have borders. We are changing the nature of those borders, and the question of what it means, you know, in terms of the freedoms of the individual to opt into that system if you don't know what data is really being collected on you, or if you do know how it's really being used. I think that's the real ethical and moral challenge. So when somebody's crossing over from Hong Kong into China, do they really know that because they're yuan when they're at the wheel, you know, this is going to be a negative mark on their social credit score?
Do you think there should be some kind of data export process so that people like you and me can know what governments know about us, like what sort of data they have on their database?
Yeah, I mean, the idea, again, you know, not to sort of always plug blockchain, but the idea of a kind of transparent, somehow decentralized database where you know what data you have given up and you sort of have more control over it is obviously appealing. You know, there are many proposals around sort of creating ownership of data, ownership rights in data, and data banks that we know what we're selling, what we're giving up, which right now we don't really have much control over.
The problem being we live in a world where the biggest company have built their business model on our data. So I'm not sure this can be doable on a purely economical point of view. Just talking about the biggest, like Google and Facebook, those guys are living on our data. I don't see coming a world where I can have the property on my data, and there's a side effect to have a property on my data, which is the libertarian point of view on data property. If I own my data, I should legally be able to sell it. But the problem is, if I sell my data, I'm selling away my free will, which is my problem. It belongs to me, after all. But I'm also selling your free will, because by having my data, there's a way of knowing stuff about you. It's pretty easy to understand. If we're speaking about genetics, if I give away my genetics, well, my father, my sister, my brother will have some consequences. It's not their data, it's my genetics. but it will affect many other people. Same goes for your personal data. It's not totally yours, because if you give it away, it will affect other people than you. So being the sole proprietor of my data is a weird point of view, in my view. At least it's the point of view where you don't take into account the commons at all and the community. You just care about yourself, which is doable in our world, but it has some consequences.
Yeah, I mean, creating a property regime around data is obviously has its own controversies. It's not the same as sort of identifiable plot of land, although you could argue that when you give somebody, sell a title to that land, you've also sold its heritage and its ancestry. We didn't ask the people before whether the new buyer wanted that land, right? So there is some analogy in the existing system of property that's not distinct, but obviously the sort of interconnectedness of data and its kind of secondary meanings does mean that you have new challenges. But you can also think of, another property regime that's a more virtual one around maybe music, for example. And when you create a musical work, you've been inspired by many things, and you potentially have taken pieces from other musical works historically or in amongst your peers. But there are various rules around what makes that property yours, and it involves some kind of originality, right? So you could imagine a sort of analogous regime being created. I can't tell you what it would be, but there could be something
once
like
again,
that.
look at genetics. My genome is totally unique, absolutely totally unique. Yet, if I give it away to Google, it will affect many people, many people. And it could be used tomorrow because some scientists will find a new way to decipher my genomes, which could discriminate me or my sister or my brother or my kids without me even realizing this, because, well, such progress will not come until 10 years, so it's totally impossible to imagine that, for example, just by reading my genetics, you could predict, I don't know, whatever, the date I'll die, therefore not give any insurance to my kid because he has the same genome. This could happen. And once again, being the sole proprietor of any kind of data concerning ourselves is a very selfish way of seeing data. And we should really, especially among people who are thinking about how to help migrants coming from different countries and how to create some common good, I think the biggest caveat today is we're not the sole proprietor of our data. It's being used by many companies who are using it, sometimes against ourselves, but as individual, being the sole proprietor of our data is a very, very dangerous concept.
I think we went down a data ownership rabbit hole, but that was really interesting.
How is blockchain less private than something like a social insurance number, where you would have to give it out to pretty much any type of credit that you're applying to, and then they would have access to all of your information, whereas with an application like blockchain, they would only have access to the information that they necessarily need at the time of your application?
Blockchain, by definition, is something public. Of course, you can build lots of other stuff on top of this, but the major propriety of a blockchain is that it's public. If you check the Bitcoin blockchain, you can have all the transactions ever made on the Bitcoin. You can check anything, it's public. So the idea, I guess, but there's lots of research and experiments to do on blockchain and ID, especially for migrant people. But the idea is to have all this publicly available for any government, any institution to check. So it's quite the opposite of privacy, actually, which is a problem by itself. Because in many instances, you will need your ID to be private.
What is visible is what you build into the user interface that you would then use to read the information that is hashed, right? So if you look at Etherscan, which is the public Ethereum network, you would just see a hash, right? You would see the public keys of the two people transacting, right? But you look at that and you can't really see what it is. But you can build a user interface. It's so weird hearing myself. Yeah, you can build a user interface that could then access that information, right? So like supply chain tools, et cetera, that you could then permission. But that's all kind of like a design principle. And you build it into the code or the smart contract, but to his point, it's what you choose. And then you can pick, like with the permission piece, you can pick this, like the range of accessibility for different users.
I'm working in the humanitarian field, and there we work a lot of civil society actors in and around Syria. And what I often hear is, when we do needs assessments, when we try to get information, the only solution that small organizations have is Google Drive, Microsoft, Salesforce, and it's usually very, very sensitive data that is on these kind of platforms. And of course, there's a lot of issues with that, but I often hear from colleagues, well, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the money, we don't have IT staff to deal with anything. How can small organizations with little money and little time in humanitarian action collect information for their own activity and inform their own interventions and make sure that it is somewhat protected?
So the first thing to do would be to define your threat model. What's the danger? If you're in Syria, my guess is that the CIA or the NSA are not the main danger. And if they peek into your information, they are most probably either checking if you're not helping terrorists, but most probably just using your information but not targeting you. So Google Drive is not that bad. Of course, you could do much better, free software. But I totally realize, although I'm a totally free software freak and activist, I totally realize how difficult it is and how a pain in the ass it can be compared to Google Drive. So obviously, I do know you don't have a choice. In some circumstances, using American technology would not be recommended, but it all depends on your threat model.
This is all on the EFF website. They tell you how to...
Yeah, the EFF have a terrific website for that.
How to define your threat model and what you should do based on what's sensitive and what's not.
The other thing, if I can, would be to check your cybersecurity to be really sure that you don't have any security feature problem anywhere that would allow not only the NSA, but because there's nothing you can do against the NSA, but the Syrian government to peek inside your data, because you would really put people in danger and you're responsible for that. So if you're an NGO and you don't have any serious cybersecurity, you are responsible really for that. And I kind of know the NGO, and very few have serious cybersecurity program.
Some years ago, as those of you who are from the UK will remember, it was mooted that we would have a UK identity card that would incorporate biometric data and so on and so forth. And there were huge protests, and the idea was ditched. And as a UK citizen who travels around the EU, I often find that people are amazed, fellow EU citizens are amazed that we don't have an ID card in the UK, and we just wander about. People say, oh, how do people know who you are? Well, they just do. They just figure it out using credible information, credible sources, and a lot of trust, combined with various other data sets. And it kind of works, and it has done for a very long time. So that leads me to my more general point, which is that your identity is not your passport. Your identity is not data that is about you. Those things are just representations of your identity, and they can never be perfect. Your identity is almost a kind of mathematical relation that you have with yourself. So with all of those points being said, I personally think that this idea of a universal digital identity is practically, mathematically, logically, and technically impossible. And the idea, it's often mooted that you could create such a thing on the blockchain, but then people forget that whenever you are evaluating that is anchored to the blockchain, at some point you have to go back to the real world and check whether it's actually true, which is the so-called oracle problem. And if you're dealing with potentially millions or even billions of citizens who all come from different places, who all have different backgrounds, then trying to encode the algorithm for validating whether that person is who they say they are would be so complicated.
Genetics.
You would never be able to test it.
Take genetics, do a hash, done. It's quite costly right now, but in 10 years, it would probably cost less than $1.
Yeah.
The problem is there's always an IT answer to this kind of thing, and most of the time it's a very dangerous answer.
That's the thing.
You're pointing right, but there will always be an IT answer. For example, your identity as a complex algorithm, it sounds like Cambridge Analytica. Really sounds like that. Because Cambridge Analytica really had this goal in order to really understand who you are on a psychological perspective, in order to give you this little nudge that will allow you to switch from one side to another. That's their goal. On the other side, your genetics, your name, your surname, the name of your parents, that's hardcore data concerning you. And yeah, it can be totally linked without a shadow of a doubt with you as a human being in the real life. It's quite costly, but you can be sure that sooner or later it'll be really very cheap.
That's a very bleak future. And we're going to end on this note. I know, right? Thank you very much for
Thank you.
talking here.
Thank you.